This is a video response to a question sent to me by an email. The question was about if God has anything to do with marriage. Of course, that by saying if he has anything to do with marriage, we're kind of asking if it is God's business to get involved in marriage, or that he doesn't really needs to get involved in that specific area. Notice that the question is accepting as a truth that there is a God. If God has nothing to do with marriage, that means that God has something to do with something else, which means that he actually does exist. So now, if God exists, would he be interested in marriage or not? That would be then the question. And I believe that he would be interested in the matter of marriage, in this issue of marriage. And the main reason is the fact that when a person creates something, that which is created has a specific purpose and is supposed to behave in a specific manner. So for instance, the person who created the car, who invented the car, knew that the car was going to behave in this or that manner given certain circumstances. And so the same is true about God and his creation. Let's say, for instance, when God created man, he knew that man was going to behave in certain ways. Now, when he created women, then he had also a plan on how these humans were to interact with each other. That being the case, then, it would be of his interest to make sure that his creation worked in a manner that was harmonious, that they will relate to each other in a manner that would be beneficial to each other. For instance, it is the opinion of the Bible that God has everything to do with marriage. In the book of Genesis, chapter 2, in verses 24, we find this: "For this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." Now this verse happens right after the creation of Eve. After Eve was created and Adam was conscious of her existence, this was his reaction: "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." And then immediately after that, we find God giving making this statement: "For this reason, because they are flesh of one flesh, of Adam's flesh, because they have so much in common," then God says, "A man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife." So then this unity, of course, is what we understand as marriage. Later on, Jesus in Matthew chapter 19, in verse 5 and 6, speaks of this matter of marriage, and also gives reference to the verses we read in Genesis 2, where he says in chapter 19 of Matthew, verse 5 and 6 says this: "And said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." Now, by Jesus saying this, adding this last statement, "Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate," obviously means that marriage was the creation of God. God was the author of marriage. Now, because God is the creator of marriage, he also gives specific guidelines that are to be followed in this institution, which, like I mentioned, is a divine institution. For instance, in the book of Ephesians, in chapter 5, we find a lot of guidelines about marriage. For instance, in verse 22 of chapter 5 of Ephesians says, "Wives, submit to your husband as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is Savior." Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. So then it's talking about the role that woman is to play in the marriage institution is that of submission to the husband. But then he goes on to speak about the responsibility of the man. In verse 25 it says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So she's submitted, but man, I tell you that the husband is to love his wife to the level that Jesus loved his church. To what level did he love the church? Well, he died for her. Later on also in the book of Peter, we find more guidance for this subject of marriage. But to answer the question in short, God has everything to do with marriage. He is, first of all, the creator of the institution. Second of all, because he created it, he provides the guideline that are to be followed in marriage. That is why man is not the one who decides what happens in the marriage relationship, but God is the one who decides what happens. And since marriage is his creation, his opinion is what must count at all time. I hope this helps, and God bless.